So it's an incredibly close, creative relationship, an incredibly powerful relationship that spans this whole 100 year, and I think remains very exciting for us, because American movie makers like to come to the UK and make films. British stars and talent like to go to the US, and that shuttlecock across the Atlantic is almost unceasing.
Adrian, another example of that is also the implication of the MPA and the United States into the British film industry as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting what was just being said by Olivier, because in actual fact, it's almost the reverse with the UK industry. I mean, there's obviously been an incredibly close relationship between the US industry and the UK industry almost from its inception, and a talent exchange that's gone on across the Atlantic for the whole 100 years. But what's interesting is that, apart from the fact that, you know, Charlie Chaplin, first global film star, happens to be British, making movies in America, but you go on from that into the sound era, and what Olivier was talking about in terms of deregulation here, it was the complete opposite in the UK. What happened is we introduced laws, quota regulations, and those quota regulations led to an actual explosion of cheap British content being funded by the studios. Now, they were demeaned, these pictures, in the 1930s, but they actually were directed by people like Michael Powell, and they're actually a lot of them are remarkably good, and the training they provided for technicians, for screenwriters and directors, actually could be argued formed the bedrock of what became the basis, the framework of classic British cinema of the 40s, 50s, 60s. All of the people that worked on those then worked on most of the sort of British cinematic masterpieces. And then the US industry, even though the quota quickie thing died, the US industry carried on investing in British talent. There was a long-standing relationship, not just a distribution relationship, but that constant talent exchange. Alexander Korda, I mean, the Third Man is partly funded out of the UK, but it's actually funded by David O. Selznick, and uses American talent to shoot in both Vienna and the UK. You have films like The African Queen, which again is co-funded British and American in 1950, and that is also shot on British studios. There are just examples in decade after decade that sort of go on through the 1960s, the 1970s. Of course, you have all the Star Wars movies made in the 1970s. You have films like Alien. So even though there's ups and downs in British cinema, and there's all kinds of complicated cultural and political interactions, the sustenance of the relationship between MPA members and the UK industry has stayed pretty much constant. I mean, of course, now we're in a completely different era where it's absolutely bigger than it's ever been, healthier than it's ever been, stronger than it's ever been, both in terms of infrastructure and talent and content creation on a scale that we've probably never seen in any of our lifetimes before. But it's built on the bedrock of roots that go back throughout that century. I mean, Stanley Kubrick making all of his films funded by Warner Brothers in the UK, all the Harry Potter films being made in the UK, Warner Brothers making that decision to make all of those movies here, and it's the same with Disney and the relationship we have with companies like Paramount as well, and all the Mission Impossible movies being made in the UK. So it's an incredibly close, creative relationship, an incredibly powerful relationship that spans this whole 100 year, and I think remains very exciting for us, because American movie makers like to come to the UK and make films. British stars and talent like to go to the US, and that shuttlecock across the Atlantic is almost unceasing.
As surprising as it may seem, piracy was already in the mind of the MPA members since its creation, Andrea.
So our founder, Paramount's founder, Adolf Zucker, was very instrumental in the creation of an organization that he knew was critical to protect the industry. Issues that would be, regulatory of the industry they were afraid of, but also the concern about what was happening at the time, which was literally copying prints and distributing them and not paying for them to the people who made them was a concern even in the teens and 20s as motion pictures first started to take off. So yes, even in the earliest days, in the founding of the MPA, along with the instrumental people that came together to create it, the concern over looking at those major issues of what this industry was going to be like. They could see into the future that this would be a long-term thing, that was part of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. They didn't know what was going to happen, and wow, if they knew. But another topic that is at the heart of the MPA's work is film preservation. And you, as the head of the archives at Paramount, you have a lot to tell us about it. So, and this, I think it's something, this film preservation, something that is also a bit inspired by the relationship with Europe. But can you tell me?
So I think. First of all, I think that what is interesting to connect to sort of this concept of piracy and protecting the industry too is just the whole notion of copyright and how that led to preservation. So when Thomas Edison wanted to copyright his films, at that point they weren't considered actual works that could be copyrighted. It actually took an act of Congress for films to be copyrighted at all. And so what he did was he actually printed out on paper the films that he made, because the Library of Congress would take books, those were paper, that would work. So he printed them out on paper and deposited those. And as in that process, actually preserved the films that he made, because nobody knew what to do with film yet. And even in those early days of the MPA and people talking about that, even then people were talking about how could they preserve this stuff, what could happen. And even Will Hayes reached out to the head of the Department of Agriculture at one point because they knew how to keep things cold. Maybe they could help. But there was an interest in this concept of preservation, I think partly around the protection of property, but it quickly also became the concept of legacy and cinema and protecting, in my opinion, the world's greatest art. And that expanded over time.
But I think you told me something about Henry Langlois. Henri Langlois.
Yeah, so fast forward to in the 1960s when George Stevens Jr., who's the son of the great director, and also a director in his own right, and has a passion for film because of his father and his father's films, but understands the history of cinema. He comes to Cannes and meets with Henri Langlois, who of course ran the Cinémathèque Française, and really starts to understand in a greater way the need for a national concept of film preservation and film legacy, and goes back and works very closely with Jack Valenti to form the American Film Institute, and the Motion Picture Association was critical in really making that happen and starting this concept of preservation. And through that act, actually some of the silent films from Paramount and other studios were preserved at the Library of Congress and deposited there during that time as well. So yeah, thank you, Henri Langlois.
What opportunities can this arrival of the platform and the future maybe of the MPA can enable, as according to you?
Well, picking up on what Valerie was saying and her emphasis on diversity, I think that looking forward, there's an incredible opportunity. The demand for content amongst the consumer is clearly unabated, and it's just going up and up and up. The amount of content that's being made by the studios and the streamers, and we certainly see that reflected in the huge amount of work that's going on in London, and the whole, actually not just London, but all of the nations and regions of the UK are benefiting from this extraordinary change driven by film, but driven also by hand television. And what I see is I'd say two things. I mean, perhaps three. The first is diversity, the opportunity, all this work and building new infrastructure. And I know there's new studios being built in France. We're building something like 3 million square feet of studio space over the next 3 years in the UK. And all of that requires people. it requires more people, more jobs, more fantastic job opportunities. So the MPA members working with France, working with other European territories, working with the UK, are helping us create long-term, fantastic new job opportunities and economic prosperity. And what I want us to do, and we are doing with the MPA members, is to try and build up that skills pipeline. I know there's a real commitment here in France, is a real commitment in the UK. We announced a partnership with Universal, one of the studio members, just the other day in Los Angeles, and actually about training. And it's also not just skills, but it is very much about diversity, the diversity of the workforce. Obviously, London has a hugely diverse population, and so lots of other European territories. And being able to harness those opportunities and bring that young, diverse workforce in, because we need their talent, we need their vision, we need their difference into the workforce, and that's one of the other major opportunities. So for me, skills, workforce, and diversity of that workforce, I think, is one of the opportunities to work looking forward to the future. And on top of that, and linked to that, is also about sustainability, environmental sustainability. The studios are doing an awful lot of work with us and with other European territories about sustainability, showing the way how an industry can green itself in terms of the way it makes things, but also where it makes things in terms of building new sustainable studio locations. And that also relates to my third point, which is the other thing that is happening is the pace of technological innovation and change in our industry. We are really at a white sort of hot heat moment in terms of when you look at virtual production, you look at the way in which virtual production and is linking games technology and film and television together, the way in which, and all of that relating to kind of visual effects. I think it's a really incredibly creative and exciting time. And if looking forward, if we can harness the opportunities of the technology, if we can harness the opportunities of building that skills base and that workforce and building it in a diverse and inclusive way, then we've got an enormous, incredibly exciting future that very few other industries can boast of. So that's what I'd say. I feel very optimistic about the future of our industry and our relationship with the MPA and its members.